Now, I don't know. I realized as I grown up that I had a very unique family, and I think we all have a unique family. We find out at some point in time that we were probably the weird ones, or not normal. But what's normal for us isn't normal for anybody else, generally speaking. But my dad, since as long as I can remember, has always been one to play games with us. My dad still not. My dad is how old is he? He'll be turning 74 this year. I sent him an Xbox during the pandemic in a baseball game so we could play MLB The Show together. And so when he comes and visits, we'll turn on the Xbox when everybody goes to bed and we'll play baseball together. And my dad's played video games with us as long as I can remember. And he's always played board games and different things like that. But one of the things I remember is that one of my favorite games to play with my dad when I was younger was the game Uno. And I don't know if you've played Uno, but this is a card game. It's based on the cards in your hand. You want to match them in color or by number on the card. And really the goal of the game is to get rid of your hand before everybody else gets rid of their hand, as well as teach you a little bit of Spanish to say Uno before the other players get rid of theirs. That's kind of the point of Uno. I'm sure most of you, or at least many of you, have played this game before. And you can employ different strategies to beat your opponents, but none of them really proved useful to me, especially when I was like 5 years old trying to play my dad. And then I found a new strategy that actually worked for me, is I realized that in the reflection of my dad's glasses, I could see the color of his cards. And that created an advantage for me because I knew what colors not to play so he could go out, and I would keep him from going out first. And I'm not sure that my dad figured out that strategy that I used. My dad was definitely one of those people that did not let you win. He thought you needed to learn through the adversity of trying to get better, and that's probably why I never played basketball very much. But anyway, I'm sure as a kid I would have received a lecture about following the rules, being honest and following the rules. I was raised, to be honest, by a couple of rule followers, and so now my kids are being raised by a rule follower as well. Now, that story about me cheating in Uno might not lead you to believe that I'm being honest, but it is. I generally like the order of things that rules provide, that I know how to go through something because I know the rules for the game. And knowing the order of things, or kind of just what's expected and how you're supposed to do things, helps me really feel comfortable because I know what I should expect. Now, many of you, I assume, or some of you, I assume, are the same way. In fact, being around some of you and just people in this area, or during a Bears game, or hearing you talk about the Cubs or the White Sox, or even a particular play during Upward basketball, I'm left with a couple of impressions. One is that you are an expert at the rules, especially when they're not followed. When a referee makes a bad call, it messes up the order of things because it didn't follow the rules, and so you know it. And so a lot of us, we know the rules better than anybody else when somebody else is responsible for making the call. Is that not true? Yeah. You know what call should have been because you are an expert at the rules. Secondly, for many of you or your team, you are one or two bad calls, blown calls by the refs away from greatness. That if that ref had just made the right call, we would have won. If that ref had just done this, you might have lost by 30 points, but if that ref had just made the right call, we probably would have won. Now, I come from somebody who can commiserate with that. I'm a long sufferer Browns fan, and there's plenty of things I can point to. If that one thing had changed differently, we would have won. It would have been so awesome. We probably would have won for years to come, and probably not. We probably would have blown it some other way. But that's just one of the things, is that we become an expert in the rules, and we're just really upset about it. The idea of how things work and the rules can give us a framework for knowing what's fair, what to expect to a certain degree. And we often can get into the mindset that if everyone just followed the rules, then they'd be good, I'd be good, and we'd all be good. But there's always a couple of knuckleheads, we feel like. And it's not us, obviously, it's everybody else. But the problem is, if we're honest, is life doesn't always work within the parameters of what we expect. Right? You were probably told certain things growing up, like if you just put your head down and work hard, things will work out great for you. Some people put their head down, worked hard, and got let go when a plant moved, or when a job could no longer support them. Some people did that kind of thing, and so some of those things, whoa, that doesn't seem fair because I played by the rules. And so we've experienced things in life where it hasn't really worked out the way that we thought they were because people aren't playing by the rules. Look around at the circumstances of life today. How do you explain all of them? What order or what rules explain the reason for what life is like in our communities, in our country, and in the world in 2024? Is it the Mayan calendar that has everything falling apart? Is it God's wrath for the reason? Is it chaos theory? What's the reason exactly for our world kind of feeling like it's out of sorts? With that question in mind, I want us to kind of keep that in mind as we step into John chapter 9 today, where we find Jesus and his disciples attempt to answer a similar question. Now, this is the first of our message of our series called Foolish Ways, which looks to explore how the ways of God quite often don't make sense to us in the rules that we come to understand for life. A little sneak peek, you might know something about the Bible. In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes that the cross seems like foolishness to the world. But even for us, there are things that God does that just do not make sense. And some might use the word foolish. Now, some might say, I don't feel right using the word foolish, but that's just a general sense. We can say there are things, the way that God does things, that we just say, that's not the way we would have done it at all. And I think as we lead to Easter, we can say that again and again and again, because Jesus does not do things the way that we would do them. This week, we find a man that's blind since birth, and what we see is that people often understand life in terms of karma, all the while carrying a deep need for grace. What I mean by that is life is often, we view things as people getting what they deserve, but really what they need is grace, the grace of God specifically. We read that in John chapter 9, beginning in the first verse. Like I said, that's where we'll be today. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn there if you haven't already, or if you have a Bible app, you can tap your way there. Or if you don't have either of those things, it will be on the screen. John chapter 9, we're going to kind of drop in and out of the verse or passage, but here's where we begin. And here's what we see. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Now, the disciples are primarily interested in a couple of things here. Just I see in the first two verses, what I see is that they're interested in, they're partially asking a people continually have throughout the entirety of history, and they continue to wrestle with even today. And that is, what is the explanation for pain and suffering in our world? You ever met people and say, why? Why are things like this? Why did this happen? What is the order of things? How do the rules of life work? If you remember the story of Job, right? He has three friends. At least they call them friends. I don't know, because by the end of it, I'm like, these aren't friends at all. But these three friends come and give him counsel, explaining why he's in the predicament he's in. Have you ever gotten to a situation and you're saying, why, God? Why did this happen? Why was that person taken? Why am I going through this? Why is that person going through this? Because you know what? It doesn't always add up in our mind. But even as they ask why the man is blind, they don't ask an open-ended question of just, why is he blind? They ask, did his parents sin or did he sin? Like, they know the answer. It has to be one of those two things, that obviously he's blind because someone has sinned in his family. It's like the question, have you stopped stealing cars? Some people would say, have you stopped hitting your spouse? That question paints you into a corner, doesn't it? Because if you say, yes, I've stopped, then it says at one point you did. Or if you say, no, I haven't stopped, that means you're continually stealing cars or hitting your spouse or whatever the case may be. Jesus doesn't need to see the disciples' cards in the reflection of their glasses to reveal their hand, because they've done it through their question. Their question reveals how they believe that these kind of things work. They are implying there's an order of things where pain and suffering are the result of personal sins or the sin of your parents or your family. Now, really, this line of thinking isn't too far-fetched or even just for the Middle Eastern disciples 2,000 years ago from what many people believe today. We often view life through a half-baked view of the traditional Hindu belief called karma. Because people say, man, karma's going to get you, watch out. Right? There's this idea that you are going to get what you deserve one day, and I want to be there to see it. I got popcorn ready, and I can't wait for you to get what you're going to deserve. Now, we think we get this idea, and we really like this idea when applied to another person, right? We love it when the person that flies past us 20 miles an hour over the speed limit goes like, well, I hope you get in an accident, or I hope a cop gets you, or I hope whatever else, right? We're hoping that they get what they deserve, or the person cuts you off in traffic and slams on the brake, and I'm like, I hope one day you get in trouble for that. Or there's a person in your life that's just simply a jerk. You're like, ooh, you're going to get it one day. Karma will get you. I don't need to. But the reality is, the rules of karma say any and all pain and suffering you experience are a direct result of something you did typically in a previous life. So if something happens to you, you are not a victim of someone else or of circumstance. You are a victim of what you had done in a previous life. And so karma is now paying you back in this life. Right? So when a person cuts you off on the freeway, you deserved it because of something you did in a previous life. When a child develops leukemia, it's because of something they did in a previous life. Play that out to its end, right? The first one we laugh at, the second one we say, ooh. But that's how it works. Every single instance of pain and suffering is a result of something you did in a previous life. Now, the disciples believe in a very similar set of rules, maybe not the previous life part, but they believed in a specific cause for the specific event they saw in this man. They're saying, here are the two options it could be. Either he sinned or his parents sinned. And so Jesus knows this. I mean, obviously they told him, and he started to unpack this thing that he has a different way than what they think. He says in verse 3, it is not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus doesn't have time for games. He gets to the disciples, he basically tells them, stop wondering about why this is this way. Stop thinking about, what's the juicy details of his sins or his parents' sins. Instead, Jesus talks about God being seen in this man's life and then talks about taking care of it quickly before the time to make a difference is gone. Sometimes that's our problem. Can we admit that? We want to say, I want to sit back, I want you to come, and I want to understand the whole situation before I help. And I feel like in some ways, Jesus is telling the disciples, we don't have time for all that mess. We don't have time to talk about why this happened. We got today, and the opportunity is in front of us to take care of it today. And before the opportunity is gone, we need to make a difference. It's almost as if Jesus and the disciples come to a house on fire, and the flames are raging, and the disciples are saying, let's do an investigation about how this fire started. And Jesus is saying, who cares how it started right now? We got to get people out of there. We got to save people out of the flames. We don't have much time. Let's get them out. Let's put the fire out. Do you think, like the disciples, get too caught up in who's to blame for the circumstances that someone else is in? Is it possible we ever get caught up in that? Instead of seeing their need, instead of seeing their fire, we think we need to figure it out. And then we say, well, the problem that you're in is your own choices. And sometimes that's the case, right? But there are things like a blind person where most of the time it's not their choice. And so, if it's their fault, and so sometimes I think we get this line of thinking that, hey, if I can somehow tie it to something they've done, then it's their responsibility. Then all of a sudden I'm relieved of needing to do something because they need to fix it themselves because I can't fix them. And so we come up with all these arguments about why it's not my problem. We fill in backstories. We fill in motivations for other people. And we tell them, I knew what they intended when they did that. I can tell by the way they did it. Let me tell you something. More often than not, you don't. You see the outward action. You don't see the heart. You don't see the mind. And even if you do know that, it doesn't preclude you from helping them according to what Jesus is doing. Can you ever relate to doing that kind of thing like the disciples? Jesus talks about then the power of God being seen in this man, but how? Well, he's going to tell us, he's going to show us actually. John writes about it, says, then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, some said he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I'm the same one. They asked, who healed you? What happened? He told them, the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes, and he told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. Where is he now? They asked. I don't know, he replied. The power of God is on display in the transformation of this man. I mean, he was transformed. He was so much transformed that people didn't even recognize him. I mean, can you imagine? It's not like he could just see all of a sudden, like his eyes look different. I'm sure his whole countenance looked different. Probably there was a glow to him. You know, like he had to be ecstatic. He could see, like colors he had only heard about. He could now see with his own mind, with his own eyes. He didn't need anybody to explain it to him. People that he'd known his whole life, now he gets to see them in the flesh. And he was so transformed that people didn't recognize him who had known him his whole life. The power of God that Jesus displays is in a changed life more than simply changed vision. Encapsulated in all that, I believe, is that Jesus doesn't work in the order of things that we typically think will, right? We would have told that man, here's some ointment, put that on your eyes, go see a doctor, all these other things. And then here comes Jesus and he rubs mud on it. We're like, mud? What? And spit? Can you imagine if someone spit on the ground and then picked up something and said, hey, put this in your eye? We probably wouldn't even touch it. We'd be like, oh, is there some kind of, do you have gloves? Like, something like that. But here's Jesus demonstrating that. Jesus doesn't play by the rules. Jesus doesn't get caught up in how the blind man got to where he is. He doesn't say, I wonder how he got to be blind. Instead, he gets caught up in how the man is going to be different going forward. So many times, like the disciples, we want to know the reasons why so we can make sure that life works the way we expect it. Maybe we want to know why so we can keep the responsibility to act on someone else and say, well, that's their problem. Go and talk to their own family. Maybe we want to know why so we can explain why someone is worse off or why we're doing better than what they are. And saying, well, that explains it. I'm glad I didn't do that. But John already told us in chapter 3 that God so loved the world that he sent his only son not to judge the world, but to save the world. And so he doesn't come here asking a lot of questions about what's happened before I got here so I can judge you. He's saying, I am here today. Let's change that going forward. And so sometimes when I say or I pray, you know what, God will meet you where you are, this story is a perfect example of that. He doesn't care about what you've met to this point. You've met him now. What are you going to do about it? And he's saying, hey, I'm not here to judge what you've done. I'm here to save you so your future looks different than the way it's looked up to this point. Jesus demonstrates God's powers and ways where more than circumstances are simply changed, people are transformed. And we are reminded, more than Jesus is interested in changing the circumstances of this life, of your life, of my life, God is interested in transforming you. It doesn't mean we don't pray for change in circumstances. It means the ultimate goal, though, is to change you and me. More than he wants to deal with how you got to where you are. And granted, I believe that as you align your life with the will of God, as you join them in fellowship in the way that you live and behave, maybe some of the trouble you got into that was caused by your actions will be changed as he draws you to a different life. But Jesus deals with you right now and changes where you're going, not where you've been. He doesn't show up in a DeLorean looking for a lightning bolt like Doc Brown saying, hey, let's go back to the future. Or let's go back to the past. Yeah, back to the past. No. He says, let's deal with this going forward. That's why I believe, when we read this kind of story, that the pain and the suffering of life that is so common to the human experience is not because God is judging us. That will happen when Jesus returns. But the pain and suffering of this life are the result of a beautiful creation of God being fractured and infected with sin. Whether it's blindness at birth, whether it's a pandemic that we're coming out of, or it's St. Jude filled with children. Heartbreaking circumstances are not all by God's design. They are the effects of a fractured and infected creation by sin. And so being in the midst of a heartbreaking situation doesn't mean God's not happy with you. But what it is an opportunity for God to demonstrate himself even there. And so I don't always, and you can disagree with me, and this is fine. I'm okay with that. Got my big boy pants on today. When people say, man, am I doing something wrong? Is God mad at me? Sometimes the answer is no. Did God cause this so he could get my attention? I don't know. I don't know that I believe that. I don't know that that always happens. I think a lot of times we attribute it to that, but I think no matter where we are, no matter what we're going through, no matter the consequences of decisions we've made or somebody else made or even that Adam made thousands of years ago, whatever the case may be, God can meet us where we are and give us the promise of a hopeful future. That whatever heartbreaking circumstances we're in is not the story forever. It might be the chapter in the book, but it's not the whole book. It's not the whole story. There's a passage in Job that says, God uses difficulty to get our attention. You know who says that? One of his friends. So I don't know. I'm not convinced. More often than not, we go through difficult circumstances, not because of personal sin, so much as the first sin of the fall of man in Genesis. Now, do we sometimes make boneheaded mistakes and get ourselves into trouble? Absolutely. Is that the only reason that things happen? Absolutely not. God can work in any circumstances. It may be a platform for him to demonstrate himself in his power, often by transforming us in the middle of the circumstance. And that's the way that God works. While karma tries to explain how you got there, the grace of God provides a transformed and redeemed way to move forward. Karma says you get what you deserve. Grace says Jesus took what you deserve, forgave you, gave you his righteousness, and brought you into the family of God so that you can have a different future. One is focused on what has happened, and one is focused on what can happen. So there's a difference there. Doesn't seem that interesting. All right. Just like a house on fire, it doesn't matter so much how it got lit when it's blazing. It matters who's putting it out and who's being rescued from it. It doesn't matter so much of how you got there. What matters is you can be transformed, accepted, forgiven, and redeemed, and adopted. And in the weeks ahead, when someone didn't prepare as much as you think they should have, when someone isn't in the right circumstances, when someone is blind to the world, will be caught up in asking who's responsible for all this, or will be caught up in the foolish ways of grace that says, let's change how you can move forward. Will you be caught up in people getting what you think they deserve, or will you be compelled to give them the same undeserved grace that Jesus Christ gives you? Let me encourage you, as people of God, or people that are wanting to follow Jesus, to choose the foolish way over karma, to choose a step forward towards a new future over an explained past, and to follow Jesus wherever he leads you, even if it seems like foolishness to the rules of how you understand life works. A great example of this is in my own life that I've seen and I've challenged people on is tithing. It's one of those things that people don't like to talk about, and they're afraid to talk about it. I think it's one of those things that does not make sense. The perfect example of that I have, the best example and testimony, I can talk about my own life, and you can say, well, you're a pastor, so you get to talk like that, is that I preached a sermon once on the idea that try giving at least 10% to God for 90 days and see if you're lacking more than you were when you started that. And if you were, the church would write a check for you for that money back. Now, I didn't check with my treasurer at the time before that, so I'm not saying that right now, so don't worry. No. So anyway, I said that kind of stuff, and I say stuff all the time that I just think, like, I don't know if anybody's listening or paying attention to or cares about, and that's fine. I'm not called for their response. I'm called to proclaim it. And so about a year later, I had a couple, and they were pretty young, and they said, you know what? We were people that we tithe with our time. We never gave money to the church unless there was a special offering. We didn't give regularly. And you gave that message, and we thought, okay, let's give it a try. And the guy was an accountant during tax season, and then he was a guy that worked on tree service in the summer and that kind of stuff. But he said, you know what the weirdest thing is? said, we looked at the year to year when we did our taxes, and we made less this year than we did last year. But our bank account has more money in it. He said, we made less, we gave more to the church, or we gave to the church, and somehow our bank account has more. And I'm not saying it's magic, and I'm not a prosperity gospel person, because I think a lot of times you give financially to the church, you give financially to the work of God, you give financially to others generously, and you might not get that money back, but God will bless you in many different ways, and you will not go without. And so it might not show up as a ledger thing where you're saying, ooh, this budget balance, and I don't even know how. But I'm telling you, it works. It's one of those things. And so I think it's the same way with the way that God works. There are things that he calls you to that will not make sense, and it's not magic, and it's not like, oh, I'm going to pull this string and God owes me, but it's just the way that a generous God works, that he's generous with his blessings. And so some people say, well, I really did everything for the church, and then my spouse still died. What gives? That's tough. We've experienced that here. No one said that to me, but you have people that gave their life to the church, that were saints, and they went through something, and they didn't come through the other side. And we're saying this doesn't make sense. But they are more blessed with God than they could ever be here. And that's hard on us, but it's great on them. God didn't pull a fast one on them. They're enjoying the blessings of God. I'm sure if you talk to them in their life, God has been good to them in ways that nobody else saw. And so, would it be any surprise that a God that doesn't rely on the past reasons for how we got into the situations we are, he just looks to give us a different future from where we are, would want his people to be the same way? It's foolishness. It is. Following Jesus won't make sense to other people, and a lot of times even you. But we're not called to be able to see, okay, God, how's this all going to play out? He just says, follow me. Pick up your cross and follow me. And when you pick up that cross, you're being nailed to it and saying, I have no rights other than to follow Jesus. You are my own. I will follow you. He doesn't promise you that he's going to tell you what's going to happen on the other side of today. But he says he is there with you already. And he's with you now. And so I encourage you to be a people that choose the foolish ways of Jesus over karma, over getting what other people deserve, over praying they get what they deserve. There's nothing wrong with praying that, God, help me, help them, help me to know what to do. But one that recognizes, hey, we have a God that's generous and grace and mercy to me and to others. And so let us learn to live like Jesus in that way. Will you stand with me as we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you for